So I know it's not obvious to a lot of people, but if you live in a country like Canada, where I live, or let's say the United States, you've hit the historical jackpot, at least in terms of material prosperity. Like, if we're going to talk about creature comforts, you and I are saturated in luxuries that the aristocracy would have only dreamed of only a few hundred years ago. And you'd never guess this was the case by how much we protest and we complain about our lot in life and the injustices that we tolerate. But believe it or not, that's actually evidence of how good we have it. And it seems paradoxical, I know, but the more equal a society becomes, the more obvious any perceived inequality also becomes. Like, think of a school, for example, with a really strict dress code and uniforms. Everyone looks and dresses exactly the same. But then imagine one person wears like a brightly colored hat one day. They'd be as conspicuous as an attractive female at a Warhammer tournament. By contrast, in a typical school setting with no dress code, a bright hat would hardly ever get noticed. The closer you get to full equality, the more obvious it becomes when someone has something you don't, and the more tempting it is to indulge in resentment and jealousy. So yes, we have things really good in spite of the fact that we don't really seem to appreciate it very well. But getting to this point in history, it wasn't inevitable as some people seem to believe. It required communities and civilization in general to reach certain milestones that were too evasive for countless civilizations that otherwise missed out or succumbed to decline and collapse instead. And I'd argue that were it not for Christianity, the world we now enjoy would be a very different place, and not by accident. It required the unique Christian contributions to its development to get us here, even if they aren't unique to Christianity today, which is part of the reason we don't recognize Christianity's unique contribution. But prior to and outside of Christianity, these developments were largely foreign and elusive. Now, one more quick disclaimer is that I obviously believe in the incalculable spiritual benefits of Christianity, but because we live in an age dominated by pragmatism and practical atheism, I'm going to talk about the temporal benefits that Christianity has afforded society in general, because that's usually the grounds on which its critics most enthusiastically target their attention. So to have a prosperous society, you need to get the fundamental basic building blocks right, and they don't get more fundamental than the family. And while I don't have time to go into every detail about this, but I would invite you to check this out for yourself, there are mountains of research which confirm that people who descend from a happy and whole family with parents together achieve far greater measures of success by all the standards that sociologists love to measure. They perform better in school, they're more likely to go to college, they're less likely to struggle with like drugs and mental illness or run-ins with the law, and of course, that all depends on a happy or at least functional marriage of their parents. And while all cultures have recognized the necessity of marriage, Christianity was the first to elevate it to a sacrament, giving it a solemn spiritual significance. Now, if you don't believe in the spiritual dimensions of life, you might be thinking, well, big deal. But that would ignore the fact that Christianity takes sacraments very, very seriously, and Christians take sacraments seriously, and they place all kinds of obligations on the spouses in order for it to be valid. For example, in most pagan cultures, marriage was treated like an economic exchange or something that was merely a benefit to the husband, like his wife was a piece of property. This was certainly the case in pre-Christian Rome, but in Christianity, the sacrament of marriage gave a whole range of rights to the woman that the natural world didn't require. For one, in order for the sacrament to be valid, both parties had to freely consent to it. In fact, the spouses are the ministers of the sacrament. So the bride is a minister to her husband in that sense. So if the male wants to remain in good standing with the church, there can't be any indication that he or anyone else forced the wife to marry him against her own will. So the sacramentality of marriage in the church turned it from an institution with practical economic implications into a relationship of equals, at least insofar as conferring the sacrament is needed. And that, as such, the relationship should be based on love more than anything else. And the husband couldn't just do whatever he wanted. In most other cultures, again, especially in the pagan ancient world, Adultery was commonplace for men, but the wife was restricted from doing so. In a sacramental Christian marriage, the man had to remain faithful to his wife as she did to him. Another seriously overlooked influence of the church is in the outlawing of incestuous marriages, especially first cousins. Now, this is probably easy to overlook and not appreciate because we assume that laws against that kind of thing aren't really all that necessary because who wants to marry their cousin? But think about what it is like to live in a world with far less economic privilege and without modern means of transportation. There's a scene in The Lord of the Rings in which Sam and Frodo are setting out on their adventure, and they're about the furthest away that Sam has ever been from his home, but they're still within the Shire, which is a pretty accurate depiction of medieval and ancient life. It was commonplace all the way up to the later modern era for people to be born, live, and to die in the same place. So that means your local community, often a farming community, is all you have to find a potential spouse. Which means it would be a lot easier if you could just marry one of your cousins. But the church specifically decreed that this would make the marriage invalid. And I think we fail to realize how much dysfunction in our society this actually spares us from. Because inbreeding produces a vast array of problems for a community. It creates physical deformities, mental disability, mental illness, behavioral problems, and increased mortality. And if you're living in a vulnerable stage of development as a civilization, having those things on top of the already significant challenges the world presents to you is going to make it really, really hard to progress to the next phase of development. And amazingly, this is actually something that is re-emerging in countries where it hasn't been a problem for a long time, especially formerly dominantly Christian countries. In Great Britain, for example, they're trying to implement programs to encourage members from minority communities who weren't born in the UK to avoid marrying relatives because it's so commonplace where a lot of them come from, and because it results in a doubling of instances of birth defects in those communities. This is especially common in Islamic countries like Pakistan, where it's estimated that 50 to 60% of marriages are between cousins because the Quran doesn't forbid first cousin marriages, and Muhammad himself married one of his first cousins, which makes discouraging that kind of thing very, very difficult, and the consequences extremely deleterious to the welfare of society. The next thing that Christianity did, which was unprecedented, was to elevate the dignity and standing of the poor and the working class. It did this most obviously in the fact that Jesus, the Son of God, was born to a virgin of low standing. And when the angel Gabriel announced it to her, her reply was, "God has shown the strength of his arm. He has scattered the proud in their conceit. He has cast down the mighty from their thrones and has lifted up the humble. He has filled the hungry with good things, and the rich he has sent away empty." The other obvious way that Christianity did this was in Christ's teachings about caring for the marginalized and loving your neighbor, regardless of their cultural or religious affiliation, but also because of who he picked to succeed him in establishing his church. He didn't pick scholars or merchants or noblemen or other fine, rich people. He picked fishermen, tax collectors, carpenters, and otherwise uneducated working class people, and he gave them honors that had otherwise been reserved for God in some respects. He said to them things like, "Whoever listens to you listens to me and God who sent me. Whoever rejects you rejects me." Later he told them that whoever sins you forgive, they are forgiven, and whoever sins you retain, they are retained. It was well understood in that time that only God could forgive sins, yet Jesus was giving them that divine authority to a ragtag bunch who otherwise wouldn't be trusted with the most insignificant temporal affairs. And Peter and the other apostles and their successors were afforded the utmost honor in the early church. They had supreme authority as teachers and governors over ecclesiastical affairs. It didn't matter what your rank was in society. If you were a Christian, you were obedient to the apostles and their successors, who were often of low rank to begin with. And the place of women is notable in this story as well, because the first person that Jesus revealed himself to after his resurrection, with the goal of placing her as the first witness to this event, was Mary Magdalene. In the ancient Roman world, you couldn't call women second-class citizens because they weren't citizens of any rank. A woman had to be under the guardianship of either a father or a husband who ruled her life absolutely. And in ancient Judea, a woman wasn't trusted to act as a witness in legal proceedings. So the fact that Jesus specifically appeared to Mary after his resurrection and commissioned her as a witness to go and tell the others would have been shocking and even scandalous to the audience that first encountered the narrative of the Gospels. This is one of the reasons Christianity was so attractive to the masses of people, and why it was so difficult to suppress in spite of the scale of persecution Christians suffered in the Roman Empire. In the 4th century, the Emperor Julian tried to rehabilitate paganism and to root out Christianity, but the poor and the working class, they stubbornly refused to go along with his new programs. So he implored the priests of the various pagan cults to do as the Christians do by setting up charitable efforts for the poor. But his efforts were ultimately in vain, as he couldn't convince the masses to make this shift because it didn't fit with the general message of the pagan gods, who were often cruel, self-centered, and aristocratic in their dealings. In the ancient pagan world, the virtue of generosity was only employed for the gratitude it inspires and the admiration it might produce in onlookers. Aristotle, for example, taught that generosity should only be directed towards the right kinds of people at the right time, whereas Christianity doesn't discriminate among your neighbors. And we continue to be influenced by this moral tradition today, but there isn't really a practical or rational reason why, unless there's some sort of eternal consequence. Like, why should we care for the poor or those who can't return the favor? Why should we be inspired by Christ's parable of the Good Samaritan, in which someone helps someone who's otherwise dying at the side of the road and who will never repay that debt? You might say, because it's the right thing to do, but how do you account for that rationally? There is no rational reason why it's the right thing to do. There's no reciprocal benefit to society to care for those who can't contribute anything back to society. This is why anti-Christian atheists like Friedrich Nietzsche hated Christianity so much. He called Christianity's concern for the poor a kind of slave morality. He believed that the focus on the poor and on the weak was a way for those who felt powerless to assert themselves to gain moral superiority over those who had actual power and superiority. The Nazis under Hitler said something similar, but applied like a racial veneer to the belief that Christian care of the weak interrupted natural selection from purifying the gene pool of the human race. They believed they had to correct this through programs like eugenics to prevent inferior people from breeding. And logically, Nietzsche had a point. The only reason we have an enduring conscience about caring for the marginalized outsider is because Jesus first implored us to do so. It's not a moral conclusion we have arrived at logically, because there's no logical reason to do so unless there's, again, some eternal benefit. The last thing I wanted to highlight as quickly as I can are the codes of chivalry. After the fall of the Roman Empire, the European continent was taken over by regional and tribal warlords, who eventually became the Second Estate, which was the ruling military class of Europe. And because warfare was their vocation, that's the vocation of the Second Estate, they couldn't help constantly declaring war on their neighbors. But as the church successfully converted the ruling class to Christianity, they basically started the first peace movement through this brilliant maneuver. They started to promote what was known as martial codes of honor and chivalry through heroic romantic tales like the Arthurian legends. They held up figures like King Arthur and Lancelot as a model to live their lives after. And I don't have time to explain the whole origin story or how they did that, but the Arthurian legends, as an inspiration for what a soldier should embody as a noble knight who defends the honor of the people, it was a whole conspiracy of the church and of the clergy. The church relentlessly promoted this vision of what it means to be a military ruler, and it caught on. And it had a twofold effect. It meant that their military resources and energy was converted from nonstop warfare to the cause of defending those who couldn't defend themselves. Secondly, it had a chilling effect on the destructiveness of warfare, especially on the collateral victims. The codes of honor meant that Christian soldiers had to observe honorable ways of fighting and to restrict violence to combatants. It also meant you couldn't do things like ambush your enemy. You met him out in the open, face to face with honor. If you've ever watched a movie depicting warfare prior to the 20th century, if you're like me, you probably thought, why were they so stupid just to line up against each other in an open field and stand there as bullets came flying towards them? Why didn't they take cover or build trenches like we do now? I also remember reading a diary account from a Native American warrior who was convinced that if an all-out war took place against them and the white settlers, the natives would win hands down because he saw how they conducted warfare against each other. By meeting in open fields, like I just described, he remarked that they obviously had no idea what they were doing when it came to warfare, and that it was much more effective to raid your enemy under the cover of night and to use guerrilla-style tactics. And he was right. Those tactics are much more effective if your fundamental aim is just to destroy your other enemy. But what he didn't understand was that they were practicing a military tradition descended from Christendom, which was designed to limit the destructiveness of warfare as much as possible. Sadly, as Christianity and the influence of the church was overthrown in the modern era, that honorable way of fighting gave way to the carnage and bloodbath of the 19th and 20th centuries. Can I ask you to stick around for one extra minute? Because if you enjoyed that, well, first of all, thanks for watching. But now I could really benefit from your help, which you can do in a couple of ways. You can check out my sponsor, Real Estate for Life, who is a network of pro-family real estate agents that can connect you with one in your area. So if you're looking to buy a home, check them out at realestateforlife.org. And if you can help out directly financially, I tend to trust that most of my regular viewers can afford to drop a $5 tip in my jar once a year. And if they did, I wouldn't have to worry about the financial viability of this effort. So if you do want to support, you can go to brianholdsworth.ca/support or join me in my locals community to get exclusive content and chances to interact with me and members of the like-minded community at brianholdsworth.locals.com.